When you look at, you know, the emerging forces in society that are tearing it apart, what are the biggest ones to you in your mind?
Well, certainly ideological possession plays a huge role. And I suppose to some degree that's probably misplaced spirituality. It's something like that. And so I've always been struck by Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's analysis of the pathology of the West, you know, that we're still suffering the cataclysmic consequences of losing our religious grounding. You need some conceptual scheme at the highest level of philosophical generalization. You need some way of answering what is good and what is evil, and some way of answering what's the purpose of my life, and maybe what's the purpose of existence. And at that level of analysis, the only answers are religious. Now, you can debate the rational acceptability of those answers, but that doesn't matter. I'm talking about the level of analysis problem, right, essentially. If you're talking about such things, you're in the religious domain. Well, intact cultures, let's say, or traditional cultures, have a structure of ritual and myth and dance and music and art and story that frames that uppermost domain of conceptualization. And people live within that. When it's fragmented and shattered, as ours has been, people turn to substitutes. And those substitutes have all too frequently been, well, either a cataclysmic loss of faith in existence itself, which is a nihilism that has a terrible psychological and social consequences, or the elevation of an ideological position to the status of a religious belief. And that's not good. And so everything in its proper place, you know, you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And, you know, the rationalist objector will say, well, there's nothing that's God's. And I would respond to that by saying, be careful what you presume. Right. Because something has to act there. Something has to exist there. And you fall into a religious story. So if with the critique you laid out, for example, of social institutions, you say, well, they tend towards corruption. And maybe they're so corrupt that only a fool would have faith in them. And that's a powerful argument. But it's essentially a religious argument. What it does is it takes the problem of evil. So it assumes that there's evil, which is the corruption and the power. Maybe you don't use the term evil, but it doesn't matter. It's still what you're referring to. And then it places it in social institutions, says the problem of evil is located in the social institution. Well, that's a religious claim. It's also a faulty religious claim, and it'll twist you up and bend you around because it's incomplete. And I tried to detail that to a large degree in chapter 11 when I talked about, because you can find malevolence in your own soul. You can find malevolence in other individuals. You can find it in the social order. And you can find something that looks like malevolence or certainly feels like it in the natural world. Right. And if you only focus on one of those, then, well, it's very convenient for you. I mean, so one of the things I always wonder, for example, if you locate evil in the social world, let's say in the institutional world, in the patriarchal tyranny, well, then you found an enemy. Right? And then you found a target for all of your unexamined spite and resentment and cruelty and homicidal tendencies, all of that. It's very dangerous. And the more sophisticated observers, and I think you can make this case merely as a consequence of observing literature, more sophisticated observers place the battle between good and evil inside the human soul. And then it manifests itself in social institutions as well, but that's not the primary locale of the divine battle. Right.
And Christopher Hitchens, the late, great, writer, had argued, in a polemic, God is not great, that religion should be replaced by the canon of literature, that theology should be thrown away and replaced with literature, that all of our great lessons that we need to know are in literature. Do you find fault with that?
Well, the deepest literature is religious. Okay. I mean, that's what Hitchens didn't realize, is that if you took 100 great books and sifted them so that you derived one greatest book from it, then you'd have a religious text. Right. And it would deal with these high order concerns that we just described. And some of that can't be done rationally, which is partly why Hitchens would locate it in literature. But it's not just literature. It's It's also located and expressed in architecture. You know, a cathedral says something about the structure of being. Now, what it says, you can't exactly say. That's why there's a cathedral instead of a description of a cathedral.
Right.
It's the same with music and perhaps particularly religious music, but secular music is religious music. It's just been secularized. It still has the same impact and the same message.
A lot of religions seem to be less relevant to people because a lot of not all of their lessons and morals, which many of them are great, but a lot of them, the big three, let's take, which you have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Christianity went through a pretty serious reformation. Judaism is a small religion in terms of the numbers of people. Islam is potentially going through a reformation now in certain countries and other, it's politically. So when people look at these religions and we say the answers are to be found there, there's sort of a deep skepticism amongst a lot of people who look at, when people were following these religions to the letter of the law and when they had an omnipresent, force in the political structure of society, it was often quite an oppressive place, whether it was, if you look at like the Catholic Inquisition or whether you look at, modern day Saudi Arabia, for example. So there's a skepticism about those belief systems being incredibly relevant now. And then you arrive at this place where people start believing in, that they're, an other kin on Tumblr or whatever nonsense that you've had to go up against for the last 4 years. So it's like, what can you create or what can we put in that? Because if people, for example, if you were raised a fundamentalist Christian, and you don't feel for whatever reason that belief system suits you anymore, and you are out there and you are looking for belief and you are looking for meaning and you're not going to find it. And who knows why that belief system doesn't suit you? I don't know. It could be your identity. It doesn't work. It could be that your family and you had it could have been that the particular church you were in was abusive. I know many Catholics who've left the church because of the litany of abuses, right? That has happened. So what can we create or how do we create some type of, and I'm not saying that we have to do it or it has to be a group project. I loathe groups and I love your focus on the individual in that sense is what makes you unique and interesting in the individuals. George Carlin had a great quote. He goes, I hate people. I love individuals. It was something to that degree. But, I agree wholeheartedly that what you see on the left right now is a lot of people that are indoctrinating themselves into a new religion that is as oppressive, as unforgiving, and as detrimental as a lot of the tenets of old religion. But what can you do if you say, I don't want to be a part of that, but I also don't want to be a part of, sort of that, archaic, superstitious kind of, belief system that you may have grown up with.
That's what we're all trying to work out, isn't it? Is what we should do. I mean, your comments about Hitchens are very interesting to me because I would say in the main, I've taken his words seriously.
Right.
Is that I do believe that the truth of the biblical truth, for example, is a literary truth. It's not a scientific truth.
Right.
Science isn't about morality. It's about something else. Whatever the Bible's about, it's about morality. Now, you can debate the moral lessons in the Bible, but the Bible's an extraordinarily complicated book, so it's not that clear exactly what the lessons are, let's say. But having said all that, I've adopted a psychological / literary approach to ethical truth. And I've learned a lot about Christianity, for example, as a consequence. So, and a lot of that was from reading Carl Jung, who wrote a lot of what he wrote in response to Nietzsche's observation that religion was dead, that God was dead. Yes. And so Jung was influenced by Freud, but at least as much by Nietzsche, and he was trying to solve the problems that Nietzsche left. Well, you could, by definition, Christ is the perfect man. Okay, by definition.
Right.
Now, you can debate his representation in Christianity. That isn't what I mean. I mean, in some sense, I mean this. each of us has a relationship, whether we like it or not, with the ideal. No matter how obscure and unarticulate that relationship is, you know that because your own conscience will torture you. And the reason it tortures you is because you fall short of your ideal. It's there in you. Now, you have a responsibility. It's pretty much the nature of responsibility to manifest yourself in accordance with that ideal. There's no escape from that. Now, what we try to do collectively is to represent that ideal and to come to some agreement about what it is so that we can organize ourselves cooperatively and in productive peace. But there's no escaping from that internal dialogue with the ideal. I mean, every goal you have is a reflection of that ideal. Every aim you have, every belief in something worthwhile, all your conceptions that there is such a thing as truth, or your conceptions that there are good ways of acting and evil ways of acting, all of that presupposes an implicit ideal. And part of what our religious structures have done was focus on Christianity, is to try to make that implicit ideal explicit, to represent it, so that we can understand it more and more deeply, and so that we can also live out its dictates, let's say, more consciously. And we're always doing this, whether we know it or not. So, for example, you and I, to the degree that we're able to have this conversation in a manner that is genuinely reflective of a seeking of the truth, then we're manifesting a religious ideal in the context of the conversation. And that's why we're interested in it. And that's why other people are watching it.
Right.
And they don't have to know that. And they'll say, that was meaningful. That struck me. I learned something. I thought I'd watch for 5 minutes, but I watched for an hour.
Right.
We can't help it. This grips us. So, for example, you'll find yourself respecting or disrespecting people. Spontaneously, you'll find yourself in awe of someone or not, or contemptuous of them. All of that means that you're in the grip of a moral evaluation that's related to this implicit ideal. And, the more I've looked at the representation of that implicit ideal in religious texts, let's say, but in the broader religious culture, the more I'm struck by its profundity. So, for example, I use this story quite frequently, but the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis is very, very short. It's only half a paragraph long. It's very, very short. But it lays out very clearly the dichotomy of personality that exists inside the human soul. There's part of us, that part that's represented by Abel, that is striving towards the light, that's attempting to serve our own interests and the interests of the broader community, and perhaps the divine interest to the best of our ability, believing intrinsically in the basic goodness of existence. And there's another part of us that's rendered cynical and bitter and murderous by the tragedy of life and our sequential catastrophic failures and inability to put ourselves together and cruelty of the world. And that's humanity. Where all of us are caught in the battle between those two opposing viewpoints. It's religious to the core. And when we lose Christianity, let's say, we lose thousands of years of the attempt to make that implicit reality explicit. And that's a catastrophe. Sure. Now, we replace it quite quickly. We replace it with the Avengers universe, where we watch the battle between good and evil being played out in movies that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make and that push our computational resources to the limit. Think about that, The most sophisticated computational devices on Earth are used to generate artificial realities where we can explore the battle between good and evil. Right. And then we line up and pay, inordinate amounts of money to expose ourselves to this. And we find it gripping. Now, we write it off as entertainment. I don't write it off as entertainment. I take it seriously.
Right.
It's a serious business.
I think the real conflict comes into, what the ideal is. And
of course,
that's where the real meat of the problem lies, right? And that to agree on that and to agree on the steps to perfecting yourself into that is where you're going to find a lot of the discord, which I know you know.
Of course.
I know that you know you've waded into those waters, and they're. But I love everything you say about groups. I loathe groups. I don't know why. I do. It is something that I was born with a natural aversion to group think, and I'm not that I can't be caught up in it like every other human being can, and I'm sure people. I can see the YouTube comments already. What does he think he? But I just don't. I don't. I'm a gay person, for example, but I find the gay movement completely insane. I don't think they represent me. I think a lot of the things that they want are absurd, and I've been vocal about giving hormones to children that are questioning their gender identity. I think is ludicrous. I think is abusive. I've said that. I've said that the moralizing and the making people like you and the making them love you and the idea that they need to conform to your belief system, to me, I've had no interest in that. I have no interest in spending my time on this planet getting people to think I'm a worthwhile human being. And maybe that's because I'm an addict. So as an addict, I can't entertain other people's ideas of me too much, because then they become resentments, and those resentments lead me back to addiction. So I have to just do what I do, and I've attracted an audience based on the fact that they know that I don't care that much, because I can't care. It's not that I'm morally superior. If I'm to stay sober and to stay effective, I can't entertain people's ideas about me too much. I can make sure that I'm being effective.
Why is that linked to your ability to stay away from addictive substances?
Because
do you know
the resentments that I will build up? There's a great line, and
I see.
Yeah, the resentments. Basically.
So think about that.
Yeah.
So if you deviate from your inbuilt sense of ethics,
right,
then the consequences of that will be so catastrophic that you have to drug yourself into insensate existence.
Correct.
Right. Well, that's exactly what I mean about the depth of the moral impulse.
Right.
You violate it at your peril.
Yes.
And you talk about agreement. Like, there are things we pretty broadly agree on,
sure.
I would say.
I'm sure.
Well, virtually no one thinks it's a good idea to teach your child to lie.
Right.
So we have a pretty deep respect for the truth. Now, we may quibble about when it's okay to bend it.
Right.
But generally speaking, we all respect and admire honesty and presume it and attempt to live in a relatively honest manner. Now, I know there are exceptions.
There are exceptions, some very
There's
successful
exceptions
ones.
to everything. Well, my experience has been that
you don't think that like success, in the way our society is set up, we're kind of we tolerate a certain level of dishonesty. Everything from the television shows we watch to our political system, we kind of expect on some level that the people that are in front of us are not necessarily. This is why I think you, by the way, have taken off so dramatically, because the things you were saying you believe. I can tell that. And the people that are watching this can tell that, whether they agree with you or not. I think when you watch how staged and manufactured American culture is, media culture, entertainment culture, political culture, we have all become a little cynical, and we all expect a healthy dose of deceit with most culture that we get. And that's why I think people like yourself have broken through that. Academic culture, I believe, as you said, many people are afraid to say publicly what they need to say or what they have said privately. And I experienced this in my business too. So while I think the ideal is honesty would be great, I do believe we've been conditioned to expect far less honesty than we should have.
Well, look, there's I have a couple of thoughts about that. The first is, while we should tolerate, on average, about as much deception from other people as we tolerate on average from ourselves, because there's no reason to assume anything other than that.
Right.
And we have to allow our institutions to move forward despite the fact that they're composed of people who on average are as corrupt and deceitful as we are.
Right.
So some of that's not so much cynicism as wisdom.
Okay.
And I would say that's a particularly notable feature of the American political system, because it's been made explicit by the founders of your of your state. They aimed to produce a system that people who were about as deceitful and unadmirable as they were wouldn't screw up too badly. That was their goal, and that was very wise.
Right.
Now, having said that, I do believe, nonetheless, that we should strive for better and that we actually want it. And one of the things I have seen that's very heartening is that now that the bandwidth limitation has been blown off video and audio communication, and the cost has been brought down to zero, essentially, people are starving for genuine conversation.
That's true.
As you know.
Yes.
You're making your living doing that.
100%.
And you, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my experience with YouTube audiences and with my public lecture audiences is, but more specifically YouTube, is that it's this long form discussion medium brutally punishes dishonesty.
Yes.
And insincerity.
Yes. If people spend that amount of time with you, they have to know who you are, or they have to want to spend time with you, or you have to have a demonstrable skill set that they find valuable.
Yes, and the conversation has to take place in a certain way.
Correct.
You know, I'm increasingly struck by the disjunction between a standard media interview and this kind of discussion.
Right.
I mean, we didn't structure this.
Nothing.
You're not attempting to do something with me other than have an interesting conversation.
Right.
Hopefully you're asking me questions that are actually your questions.
Yeah.
Now, if I go to a standard interview, especially if it's a television interview, then I'll be confronted with someone who's the face of the bureaucracy.
Right,
and virtually none of the questions they ask have anything to do with what they're interested in.
Right.
So there's an artificiality about it that can easily translate into manipulation and deceit.
Not only am I not asking you other people's questions, I barely prepared. I've seen enough of you that I said it makes more sense for me to have a genuine conversation than to prepare questions. I said, I'm just going to kind of go with the flow, people often offer to send me questions before a discussion like this, and I always refuse. Right.
And it's for that reason and I think part of the reason that people enjoy this form of communication is because it has the same quality as free-form jazz.
Right.
Or I mean, the same thing happens in other genres of music when the band members are jamming.
Yes.
It's spontaneous creation.
Yes.
And to the degree that we're capable of engaging in that, then we keep our audience take our audience along for the ride.
Yes.
And so this also relates back to your first question about the online world. I mean, I think it's an unbelievably powerful and useful method of communication. It's obviously decimating the legacy media, and for good reason. It's technologically superior and ethically superior in every way. So that's very heartening. You can have real discussions. I mean, my life right now consists of pretty much nothing but a series of genuine discussions, or they're as genuine as I can make them. And I'm always trying to learn something from whatever discussion I have. I don't go in there with a goal in mind except to
have an honest
seek
exchange.
as deeply as I can into the conversation.
Yeah, and we appreciate doing this. You have two more questions for you. This book, by the way, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, is available everywhere right now. You should grab it and read it, and then hopefully you'll be back on a speaking tour relatively soon. And hopefully you've sat down with stupider interviewers than me. I think you have. Now, I've watched some of your interviews. I think you have. Things that you would recommend that people read if people out there want to be smarter, or they want to understand you better outside of your own books, which are obviously 12 Rules for Life and 12 More Rules for Life, and then other things you've written as well. With somebody like you, I always like you to recommend reading, because, when you're talking about Nietzsche and Jung and everything, a lot of people are not connected with that stuff in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
So is there a way, are there things you recommend for them to read?
On my website, jordanbpeterson.com, under books, I have a list of about 100 recommended books, and people are buying a lot of those books. I keep track of their sales. And if you find the ideas that I'm presenting interesting, you'll find the books in that list interesting. They'll be temperamentally suitable for you, but you'd get the equivalent of a good humanities education if you read all those books.
Right.
Better, I would say. And so and they're great books. Dostoevsky, for example, if you are a fiction reader
right.
and you like exciting fiction, Dostoevsky was a master at plotting a thriller. His
right.
books are unbelievably engrossing, and they're incredibly deep.
He's very good. Have you read Chelsea Handler?
Handler? No, I haven't.
Well, I'll send you something of hers. You check her out. She's pretty good. JordanBPeterson.com. When you are doing a speaking tour, all of your dates will be up there. You can purchase the book there as well. Thank you for coming on. I know your schedule is busy, but you are making time for a lot of people, and you've done a lot of my friends' podcasts, and obviously we really appreciate it, Jordan. And I mean, I don't know that we've solved the world's problems, but we've solved the problem of people that wanted to kill an hour in a smart and enlightening way.
Well, that's something to solve
in an hour,
isn't it?
That is something to solve. All right. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the invitation.
All right. Thank you. And tell Michaela I said hello, and I'm going to cut out sugar soon. All right.
All right.
Thank
I'll
you,
do
buddy.
that.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.